Centers for Disease Control suggests people avoid using e-cigarettes as the number of serious lung illnesses and deaths believed to be linked to vaping continues to rise. There are now 5 deaths reported in the United States, and the number of serious respiratory illnesses suspected of being linked to vaping has more than doubled to 450 now in the U.S. The definitive cause is not yet clear, but the surge in cases is deeply worrying. All of those who are sick or died.
New numbers released by the CDC this afternoon point to another significant jump in cases of vaping-related lung disease. There are now 805 cases reported in 46 states and 12 deaths.
2 more people have died from vaping-related illnesses, this time in Minnesota. This brings the nationwide total to 31 deaths across 22 states. While both the CDC and the FDA have issued warnings for people to avoid vaping, the cause of the deaths and more than 1,100 injuries remain unknown.
So vaping was seen as an alternate to smoking. So what vaping is a device that you can use that has a heating element, and it heats up a liquid. It doesn't burn it like you would of smoking, but then it heats it up so then you can inhale it and it forms almost a type of vapor.
Yeah, so you said that it's seen as an alternative to smoking. Does it work that way, or is it really a healthy alternative in any way?
Oh, it's absolutely not a healthy alternative. It is not a good alternative. It is different than smoking. I would not say it's better than smoking. They've done some research looking at whether you can use it to get off cigarettes, and the answer is not really. Is that the more we learn about it, it's just providing an alternate bad outcome to smoking.
Okay, so what's the difference between a vape pod and an e-cigarette?
So the difference between a vape pod and e-cigarette is basically what's in it. If you have a traditional cigarette, which I call a combustible cigarette, it's tobacco leaf that has been treated to make it burn and make it stay longer in the pack and kind of shelf stable. So you get all the contaminants there. You get arsenic, butane, candle wax, you get all these things, ammonia, that they put into it, and you're inhaling to your lungs with a traditional cigarette. Now what they thought with the e-cigarettes, electronic cigarettes, the vape pods, is that they don't have all those contaminants, but they still contain things like formaldehyde, which you'll see in your science class, things like diacetyl, which is like the flavoring element in popcorn. I like to eat it, I don't want to put it in my lungs. You have a bunch of other fine particles, heavy metals, and a whole bunch of other things. So when they say vaping, it's not, people picture a cloud. Oh, it's just water vapor. It's absolutely not true. There's a bunch of harmful chemicals present in there.
Do we know all the chemicals, or are there ones that we don't know about?
The honest answer is we don't know. So FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, who does the regulations for this, have not had the jurisdiction over this yet. So that'll be coming in 2020. So the manufacturers are not required to tell us what is in the drug or in the product, so we don't necessarily know per se. They've actually done a good job of avoiding regulation by some crafty legal maneuvering, so they don't actually have to say what is in there.
We were doing some research and we found synthetic vitamin E is one of the things that are in there. What is the effects that that has on the lungs?
So the reason synthetic vitamin E is present in these pods is actually a stabilizing agent, so that way when they put it on the shelf, it can get there. So vitamin E is something we commonly use in skin creams and everything else, and it's okay. But the problem is it's not meant to be heated up. It's not meant to be put in the lungs. So when you're inhaling that much vitamin E, it basically becomes an oil or a fat within your lungs, and you can imagine how well the lungs like oils and fats. So when they've done this, they've done a recent study where they've put cameras down into people's lungs, squirted some fluid in, sucked it back out, and then looked at it and analyzed it. And they found, in the 30 patients they looked at this, they found 30 of them had the vitamin E within their lungs. So they think that this is directly associated with some of the damage that we're doing. There's some thought about how long does it take for somebody to become addicted to these, and that's a very individualized answer. That I can't say within a week, a month, a year. That the brain's response to nicotine is different. So what happens when the brain gets nicotine? There's these receptors, these pleasure receptors in the brain that the nicotine feeds. When the nicotine feeds these brain receptors, it forms more and more and more receptors. So therefore you need that nicotine to keep feeding those receptors to make the brain happy and kind of trigger that pleasure or reward system within the brain. And that's what makes the quitting so hard, is you might know smoking is bad for me, vaping is bad for me, but you're physically addicted to the medication. You've made changes to the receptors within your brain. So that's where the smoking cessation aids or the vaping cessation aids that can kind of tamp down those receptors. Because with that addiction, you have this almost, I think of it as a screaming or a crying in your brain that the further you get away from the nicotine, the louder and louder and louder it gets until you just can't take it anymore and you give in and say, fine, I'll have a cigarette, I'll have a vape, just leave me alone.
Yeah.
So you calm those receptors down for a bit, but then as that nicotine gets processed and taken away, that clamoring gets louder and louder and louder, and you keep going back.
Yeah.
And then the interval between it gets shorter and shorter. And that's basically what the addiction is. That's how somebody goes from having a vape on a weekend to doing a vape on a weeknight to middle of class, I'll leave and go out to my car and have another one, or I'll go to the bathroom. It's because of that physiology, the receptors within your brain are changing based on that nicotine. Then if you say, well, that's fine, I don't do the nicotine stuff, the flavoring agents still predispose you to getting into other harder drugs, which can cause significant brain changes. So we use the term gateway quite frequently, but it truly is.
So it is like a gateway into trying other.
It's absolutely a gateway. It's not I just don't do that.
I don't do that.
It's the setup to do more and more and more.
So what types of drugs are people going to be inclined to try after, trying vaping?
Absolutely. So the types of drugs, so typically you get the regular cigarettes that you move from vaping on to combustible cigarettes. You move from vaping onto marijuana, to THC, to dabs, to all those other things. And we've seen that those lead to harder drugs, such as your heroines, as your cocaines, and everything else.
So it could all lead up to the worst case.
Yeah, absolutely. And we tend to have this thought that this won't happen to us. I'm just doing this. And everyone thinks it's just them and they're just doing the one thing. But that's not true. That we've seen the science, we've seen the studies, and it really will allow for more and harder substances.
So there are different flavors of the pods and everything like that, but is one more harmful than the other? What are the different things in them?
So the difference is, so the way we look at it, we break it down into 3 different ones. We have the THC containing products, which is similar to what you have in marijuana. We have the nicotine ones, which is some of your vape pods have a higher, and your nicotine salts have higher concentrations. And then there's this misconception that the flavored ones, your fruity ones, your candy flavored ones, are safe. So when you look at we have over nearly 40 people who have died from vaping injuries. We have nearly 2,000 people who have been injured directly related to vaping. And we can't separate it based on one product. I can't tell you that flavored only is safe. I can't tell you that the nicotine are safe. I can't tell you that THC is safe. We have patients with all of those that have experienced injuries, even death. So as far as the breakdowns between THC, nicotine, and the flavors, we don't know yet because they haven't told us specifically. We're relying on kind of buying them off the shelf and putting them into laboratory studies that the makers aren't telling us there. So the short answer is there's no, well, I just do this and it's safe. Because the answer, everything has been implicated in death and harm.
So there is no form of vaping that is safe at all?
There is no form of vaping that is safe. Altria, who owns like one of Big Marlboro, bought 35% of Juul. So they're buying into these things because they call it pre-smokers, they call it pre-customers, they call it next generation. So, and one of the things I would show is the same ads that they used on, say, your parents or grandparents. They're just reshaping those. So they're using the same marketing schemes that got your parents and grandparents addicted on you guys. It's eerily similar, the stuff that they're using.
So do you have any stories that you could share regarding patients that you've worked with that have experienced effects like this from vaping?
In the Lehigh Valley, I personally have taken care of 3 patients. One was a 21-year-old girl who had asthma, who was vaping, and she ended up in my intensive care unit. Then I had a second one who was a 17-year-old kid from New Jersey, an athlete, high school athlete, baseball pitcher, and everything. And he had this nausea, vomiting, belly pain, and wasn't feeling good. And then he ended up in my hospital, and I had to put a camera into his lungs and take a look around because his lungs looked so bad on our CAT scans and chest x-rays. And then the third one I had was an 18-year-old kid who actually ended up with a breathing tube. So he was placed in a medically induced coma because of the direct effects of vaping. The thing to keep in mind here is these aren't 80-year-old sick people who've been smoking for 100 years. These are young kids, high school athletes. These are people that weren't doing it for too long. They were buying it off the shelf at the gas station or at the store, that they weren't the sick, frail, elderly patients. These were robust young people, boys, girls, all walks of life. These weren't people that were doing the illicit or illegal THC. They bought it legally of a good product and ended up in near death, frankly.
So what's your best advice for people that are trying to quit after they've started?
So the trick to quitting is to want to quit. The first step is to want to quit. As much as friends, families, parents, teachers, everybody else wants you to quit, you have to understand what you can do for it. As far as the science, there's not a whole lot of science right now behind it. We have decades and decades looking at how to quit smoking, but we don't have, with how new vaping is, I mean, granted, it's only about 10 or 15 years old. We don't have a whole lot of data to support it. What we do now is treat it similar to cigarettes. So if you are really addicted to the nicotine, if you get that restless, that anger, and that kind of insatiable thirst for more nicotine, you can use patches, gums, lozenges. If you're truly addicted, we have some medications like Chantix and bupropion that we can use. So the first thing to do is talk to your doctor. We're nice people. We want to help you out. This is not, we're not trying to get anybody in trouble, but we want to save your lungs now while you're young. We want to save your brain now while you're young. Because what you do now, while you do feel invincible, the effects really do last a lifetime. So if we can stop it early before the damage really takes hold, we can do a lot better.
And that's scary because we know that it's bad, but we don't know that much about it.
That's the problem is, as we said, cigarettes have been around for hundreds of years, right? Vaping's only been around since 2002, really kind of started to take off in 2007. So we don't have long-term studies to show what it can do. So the way I explain it to my younger patients is, you're a guinea pig. They're experimenting on you. By the FDA, they don't have to tell you what's in it. So you're putting something in your lungs that we have no idea the long-term outcomes. We have no idea the future health dangers. We've shown brain changes, we've shown heart changes, we've shown lung changes, and that's only in the short term. You can imagine what 10, 15, 20 years can do. But the answer is, at the end of the day, you go home and sleep in your bed, look in your mirror. Within a year or two, you're going to spread out to different parts of the country. You're going to spread out into different jobs. But you have to deal with your lungs. You have to deal with the consequences of what's going on. No one else is going to be in the hospital with that breathing tube in but you. No one else is going to have trouble breathing but you. So it's such a tricky spot that I find my high schoolers in and my patients of that age. But I just encourage you to really think about, is it worth it?
If you are struggling with an addiction to vaping or any other substance, talk to your doctor, teachers, or get a referral from SAP and B108.